So I've been wondering, when we talk about spiritual warfare, the Bible talks about spiritual warfare. What is meant by that, and what does it mean for us?
Spiritual warfare, that's a great question. I go back to Galatians chapter 5. Paul, in the book of Galatians, now we were familiar with Galatians chapter 5 because in verse 22 we have what we call the fruit of the Spirit. And most of us probably memorized that as a child in vacation Bible school or something, the fruit of the Spirit. But leading up to verse 22, Paul says this. So beginning in Galatians 5, verse 16. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh, for these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. If you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident, and then he goes on to name what the works of the flesh are, and then he goes on to name what the works of the Spirit is. So the fruit of the Spirit. What I want to highlight is the struggle that Paul is talking about here, the battle that's going on within the believer. There's a desire that the flesh still has to be active, but then there's also the Spirit of God working within you. And every believer knows that struggle. I think it's in Romans 7 where Paul says, I do the things I don't want to do, and the things I want to do, I don't do. And we can all relate to that struggle. Now that's dealing with the flesh. That's dealing with the sinful state and the sinful world and the curse of sin on our lives as new creation. So we've been born again. We are new, but we still live in this fallen world and in our fallen bodies. And so we're being made new, being sanctified, and that is an ongoing battle. When we think about spiritual warfare, I think that's part of it and leading into it, but not totally it. Spiritual warfare is bigger than just the battle with sin. So what I just described in Galatians 5, that's a battle with the old flesh. But spiritual warfare, I think, is going to be a little bit different than that. And spiritual warfare is where we see spiritual beings that are battling. And the way I think about it is much like I think about in so many cases in a physical war. So whether it's World War II or the Civil War here in our own country, there were these battleground cities. So pick a city from the Civil War, pick a nation maybe from World War II, or even a city in World War II, where you had two opposing forces that were coming at each other, and the point that they met was that city. So that city may not have been all that valuable. This is just where these two forces met at, and these two forces battled out, and then that city became a casualty of warfare, right? So I tend to think of spiritual warfare that way, in that you have these opposing forces or beings, and so you have God, and then you have the enemy, which we know to be Lucifer, we know to be Satan, who is battling against God. And our lives end up being that battleground. We see that in the book of Job, where Satan approaches God and says, "Hey, let me test him. Let me show you that he's not faithful." Right? And so Job's life, it wasn't anything that Job did or didn't do. Job's life became a battleground for a spiritual war to take place. In Ephesians chapter 6, that's probably our best known passage to deal with spiritual warfare. Paul's concluding this letter to the Ephesian church, and he says in verse 10, he says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil." And then here's verse 12, where I think that spiritual warfare is defined. "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And then he goes on to name the various elements of the armor of the Lord, and that we protect and defend ourselves with, prepare ourselves with. But I think what we see there is that believers are going to be doing battle against spiritual forces, and at the end of the day, somebody, just like in a physical warfare situation, at the end of the day, somebody gets to raise a banner. At the end of the day, somebody gets to plant their flag in victory. And so, when I'm counseling with a married couple, maybe that's having some sort of marital issue, I'm often reminding them who's gonna raise the banner at the end of the day. Right? It's not going to be you. You're not. You don't have a flag, right? It's either God's going to raise His flag in victory, or Satan raises his flag in victory on this particular battle. Now, God's won the big story. I understand that, but on this battle that's going on right now, who's being glorified? Whoever gets the glory, that's where that's the flag that's going to be raised. So we're either going to raise the banner of the Lord, or if we choose to not forgive and not to move on, or we choose hatred and animosity and anger, etc., then Satan wins, and he gets to raise his flag on this battle.
So, I pulled two things for me out of what you just covered there. And the first is that Scripture gives us a set of tools to use in spiritual warfare with the armor of God.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that is those are the tools that we use. We're so we don't have to sort of go in a different direction or make up something that's different than that. It's there. It's right. Very well understood.
That's right.
And the second thing is that there are real life implications to spiritual warfare.
Absolutely.
Right. So you illustrated a marriage. You illustrated. You talked about the battlegrounds, and so there is. So what is going on in the spiritual realm has direct implications for the world that we live in, and that's why spiritual warfare is important to the church and to the individuals as well.
Well, and I would remind anybody that is going through anything right now that if you could zoom out. Here's your life and your situation, and we get very focused. Let's just use marriage again. We get very focused. We point the fingers at each other as though we're the only two involved in this thing. And I want to say, zoom out a little bit. If you could zoom out and look in on your life, you would realize it's not just you. Right? It's not just you and the spouse going at it, but there is a spiritual battle that's going on around your life that you may not. And honestly, the fact that you can't see it that's Satan's tactic. He doesn't want you to see that. And to your point of tools, innovation is not necessary in spiritual warfare. We already have the tools. We don't have to make up something. I love that point. So I appreciate that. I hope that's helpful for you today.